This is the story of November 193 Golf Echo. But before we get started, we're really close to hitting 100,000 subscribers. I'd appreciate it so much if you could subscribe or like the video to get us over that mark. On the 13th of August 1999, on the ground in Manchester, New Hampshire, at 1:11 p.m. local time, a pilot was filling up his plane for a flight to Denver International Airport. He was flying a Cessna 208, which was owned by Greystoke Engineering Incorporated. He filled the plane up with 654 gallons or 2,500 liters of Jet A fuel. With this, the plane weighed 10,000 pounds or 4,500 kilograms. After that, the plane took off from Manchester Municipal Airport. As soon as the plane took off, the plane started to turn to follow the instrument flight plan that the pilot had filed. The initial parts of the climb were uneventful, but as the plane reached 800 to 900 feet in altitude, the pilot started to smell something odd. He started to smell fuel. Sometimes, some planes might smell a bit like jet fuel. That's completely normal, especially for small planes like the Cessna 208. But this smell was much stronger than that, so much so that the pilot stopped his climb and started looking around for the source of the fumes. He sat there in his seat and strained to look around and locate the source of the fumes. But from his spot in the cockpit, the pilot could not figure out where the fumes were coming from. He wasn't taking any chances. If there was something wrong with his fuel system, he did not want to find out what was broken in the air. He radioed ATC and asked them for vectors to the nearest airport where he could put his plane down. In preparation for his landing, he started descending. He then looked down and saw something that really shocked him. There, on the floor of the cockpit, was about an inch of fuel. His feet were steeped in fuel. His cabin was filling up. In an attempt to prevent an in-flight fire, he turned off the radio, which was understandable, as the slightest spark could set the whole plane ablaze. As he descended, he noticed that his situation was getting worse. The amount of fuel on the floor was growing. It was now well past the 1-inch mark and showed no signs of slowing down. But the risk of a fire wasn't the only thing that he had to worry about. The massive amount of fuel and fumes in the cabin made it hard for him to see. His eyes burned, his vision was blurred, and he could barely breathe in the cockpit. The fuel was now up to his ankles, and the charts that he used for navigation now floated freely around the cabin on top of the fuel. His situation was dire. Even if he made it to an airport, it would be of no use if he couldn't see or if he was unconscious due to the fumes. He had to put this plane down now, runway or no runway. He turned the plane into the wind and spotted a field out in front of him. It was his best option. No, it was his only option. Fighting through the blurry vision, burning eyes, and suffocating fumes, he lined the plane up with the field as best as he could. The plane touched down, and the pilot applied maximum brakes. As he landed, he saw a 3-foot deep ditch in his path, but it was too late to avoid it, and after this, he had no memories of what happened next. The plane went through the ditch, which ripped its nose gear off, and the plane came to rest on its nose. There was another plane in the air who was watching all of this unfold. From the air, the plane came to a stop, and for 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then the pilot exited the plane and crawled away from the plane, and that was not a moment too soon. 5 minutes after the plane came to rest, it burst into flames. The next thing that the pilot remembers was being treated by first responders. The pilot was fine, but his plane was burned to a crisp, and digging into why this happened brought up some interesting facts about the plane. On the 11th of August, the pilot flew the plane to Bangor, Maine for some alterations. The plane had 2 auxiliary fuel tanks installed. The Cessna 208 has 1 tank in each wing and a smaller tank under the cabin. This is more of a reservoir tank. These fuel tanks gave the Cessna 1,900 kilometers or 1,100 miles of range. If you're someone that needs more range at the expense of some interior space, then you can have auxiliary tanks installed in the cabin. In some parts of the world, like Kazakhstan, planes like these need to make long hops, and for those flights, the extra fuel is a godsend. The tanks installed in this particular 208 could hold 205 gallons or 776 liters of fuel. These tanks could not feed the engine directly. Instead, the auxiliary tanks would feed into the right-hand tank. That fed the engine. The repairs were finished on the 13th and the plane flew to Manchester. This is where the pilot opted to fill the auxiliary tanks with 190 gallons of fuel, which meant that the tanks were pretty much full. The pilot told the investigators about the modification. He said that the tanks were mounted laterally in the cabin and that they were secured to the floor using tie-down straps. All of the plumbing needed for the tanks were at the back of the tanks, and so the pilot could not check the tanks when the plane was in flight. But he still had no idea what caused the leak as he had not enabled fuel transfer from the auxiliary tanks. They decided to talk to the people who actually did the modifications on the plane. Whenever you make major changes to an airplane, like what they did here, you're supposed to fill out a form called Form 337. It's basically a way to document the changes that were made. The investigators knew that the tanks had been installed laterally, but the form showed that they were installed longitudinally. This discrepancy was not explained. That's not all. They found that the documentation given to the pilot was also lacking. The instructions on how to use the new fuel tanks did not go into all contingencies that could pop up, nor did it go into the limitations of the system. More worryingly, the auxiliary tanks had 3 pumps to transfer the fuel from the tanks into the right-hand wing tank. These 3 tanks were attached to a platform, but that platform was not secured to the plane in any way. The investigators concluded that the probable cause of the accident was the inadequate installation of the fuel tank and a resulting leak. They knew that the modification was done incorrectly, but they could not pinpoint the exact cause of the leak because the fire had destroyed most of the plane except for its wingtips. How do you think the fuel leak started? Could it have been an unfastened bolt or a ruptured pipe or something like that? If you fly the Cessna 208 and if you deal with modifications like this, I would really love to hear your thoughts. Also, how did the fire start? That was something else that wasn't answered in the report. This accident is a good example of good decision making in a very stressful, high-pressure environment. The pilot made the choice to put his plane down at the first hint of trouble, and then he decided to put the plane down in the field, which was the right thing to do. He also had the presence of mind to turn off the radio when he noticed the fuel flooding the cockpit. Had he not done that, there was a very real risk of a fire starting. On top of that, he was able to find a spot to put his plane down while squinting through the fumes. The video you're seeing right now on your screen is from my 7th attempt to recreate this accident. Half the time I just go right into a tree or something. Let me tell you, had I been up there instead of him, this would have ended very differently. If there's something good to take away from all of this, it's that the firm that did the modification on the Cessna changed their procedures after this incident. So, the next time you go to modify your plane, it'll be safer. This video is a bit shorter than my usual videos. That's because I'm traveling this week for the first time in more than a year, and so I had to choose a shorter incident. But if you still want to listen to me drone on about stuff, how about the story of the pilots who had to throw out passenger luggage to try to save their plane? You can find that video on your screen right now, or the plane that almost crashed because of a loose screw. You can also find that video on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe.